Admin, is that photo of Senna driving a completely white McLaren real? The other day I got this in my DMs and I replied straight away. I'll record a little big story to tell you all about that. At the end of 1993, Ayrton Senna drove a completely white McLaren, testing an engine that, at the time, was making its final appearance in Formula 1, at least up until now. And he got out of the car saying, "That engine there is good, isn't it? What if we used it in the last races of the year?" In the end, it didn't work out, but it's a great story, because you're watching Little Big Stories. Every week, here on Splash and Go, as you already know, there's a little story from Formula 1 or not, as long as it's quick, fun to tell, and interesting to know. Let's go! 1993 was perhaps, and I never tire of saying it here, the year of Ayrton Senna's finest driving in Formula 1. He, who was already obviously a genius, drove like a maestro in 93. After winning the title in 1991, McLaren was told by Honda, "End of 92, I'm out." In 92, even with the excellent V12 rocket engines from Honda, it was a real ordeal for Senna. The MP4-7 was a generation behind the Williams FW14B, designed by Adrian Newey and Pat Head, and driven by Nigel Mansell. The car was approaching the state-of-the-art in technology, which would arrive with its younger sibling, the FW15C, in 93. But it was very advanced, with intelligent suspension, active suspension, which I've already talked about in detail in this video here. With it, in a stroke of genius, keeping the car at a constant height from the ground, Adrian Newey, at the time much less famous, but already emerging as a talent, managed to make a car that was aerodynamically more extreme, without the risk of it hitting the tarmac, rolling, or changing its height and aerodynamic attitude. And that was that Nigel Mansell won the title. 9 wins in 16 races, even breaking Senna's record, which had been 8 in 1988. The Brazilian, naturally, was clearly unmotivated, wanting to leave McLaren by any means, and even offered to race the following year, 93, for Sir Frank's team, even for free. But for the following year, Williams had signed Alain Prost, the Brazilian's arch-rival, with whom he had shared the McLaren team between 88 and 89, and as we know, things didn't go very well. The atmosphere at the company didn't end up favorable. Prost had taken a sabbatical after being forcibly let go by Ferrari at the end of 91. And when he was approached by Williams, he set just one condition. "Look, I'll even accept the salary, which was usually low, that Williams offered, but I have one condition. With him, I won't work anymore." He, in this case, was Ayrton Senna. After losing Honda, McLaren had to make do with Cosworth, who already had a works contract with Benetton, and, therefore, Schumacher and Flavio Briatore's team would receive engines a generation ahead. In other words, everything new that Ford Cosworth developed would go to Benetton, and the second latest engines would be the ones for Senna at McLaren. McLaren, for its part, hadn't forgotten how to build cars and, from 92 to 93, invested heavily in electronics and, with the support of its partner, owned by Mansell, TAG, developed its own active suspension, pre-programmable electronic gearbox, and an ABS system that would make the MP4-8 a very good car. However, it had an Achilles heel of roughly 80 horsepower less compared to the Renault V10 in the Williams, the Ford Cosworth, and so it became difficult to compete. But notice that it's no coincidence that on tight street circuits and in the wet, the Brazilian was able to make the difference. Among other things, because a V10 engine is much harder to control electronically with traction control than a V8. And so, if it rained, Senna would run rings around the Frenchman, as he indeed did. But on other tracks like Monza, Hockenheim, Magna Acauas, and so on, Williams would end up sweeping the board, if not with Prost, then with Damon Hill. Ron Dennis, always very shrewd after Honda's departure, was actively looking for another manufacturer to come in and help pay the bills, and he found a few candidates. One was Peugeot, with whom he would eventually sign. Another was Lamborghini. I've already talked about manufacturers who entered Formula 1 and fell flat on their faces, and I touch on this story a bit. Lamborghini had considered entering Formula 1 as a works team, but always settled for being an engine supplier. And they weren't happy with the partners they found to supply. Among them were Lotus, Ligier, and LaRousse. So, The chance to test with McLaren was like going for your first job interview at a big company. McLaren, since the early 80s, had been a major organization, had won most of the championships, and now found itself without an engine. But maybe, just maybe, Lamborghini would work out. So Ron Dennis organizes a test and, already knowing that Senna was leaving for Williams in '94, says to the Brazilian, "Would you mind driving this car here and giving me a very friendly evaluation?" For contractual reasons, of course, since it wasn't exactly a 1993 McLaren, Senna would do the test wearing an entirely white race suit and driving an all-white car, but with his unmistakable yellow helmet. The car's wheelbase had to be altered because the Lamborghini V12 engine was naturally a bit larger than the Cosworth V8, although it was lighter. Senna did the test, really liked the power response, and then started pestering Ron Dennis. "Let's try to do the last 2 races of the year with this engine." Ron Dennis obviously knew the trouble he would get into with Cosworth. After all, there was a valid contract in place. And, in any case, even with the positive feedback from the Brazilian, he would end up signing with Peugeot. And it wouldn't work out, because in '96, that's when McLaren would tie up with Mercedes, with whom they stayed until 2014 and are now back together. But Senna liked the engine and said, "The power response is very good." There is no video footage of the Brazilian driving the car, but there is of Mika Häkkinen at Silverstone. But fate knows what it's doing, and, fortunately, Senna didn't drive with that engine, which broke down a lot and probably wouldn't have given him his last 2 victories at Suzuka and Adelaide at the end of that season. Every cloud has a silver lining. So, that was another little big story from Splash and Go on YouTube. I hope you all enjoyed it. Leave a like, it's free, doesn't cost a thing, you know, and it really helps the channel. Do me this favor, do us this favor.